You're watching AWANI International. I am Cynthia Ng. Now, President Donald Trump's visit to Malaysia is the first U.S. presidential appearance at an ASEAN Summit in 3 years. Now, trade deals were signed, a ceasefire agreed, and American engagement in this region is once again in the spotlight. Joining me to discuss what it all means for U.S.-Malaysia ties and for the wider region is the U.S. Ambassador to Malaysia, His Excellency Edgard Kagan.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, and it is such a pleasure to be here. It's particularly a pleasure because this has been such a monumental few days in the U.S.-Malaysia relationship, but I think in U.S. engagement in Southeast Asia. I was just talking to a friend for whom I have tremendous respect, someone Malaysian who I've known for over a decade, who said that what we saw was a geopolitical shift. And I think that we've genuinely seen a geopolitical shift in the last 48, well, I guess slightly more than 48 hours, where we're in a region where people had questions about U.S. commitment, U.S. staying power. We've seen the U.S. not just show up, and you're right, it's the first time in 3 years, but show up in a way that I think very few people expected. So my view, President Trump's visit to Kuala Lumpur delivered very significant benefits for the people of Malaysia, for the people of the United States, and I think for the region as a whole. And this runs from areas, obviously peace and ending war, but also supporting trade, supporting prosperity in both of our countries.
We'll get to more of that later, but just going back to first U.S. president in 3 years, and President Trump's first ASEAN Summit since 2017. Ambassador, why now? What made this the year to show up? Because we have seen the U.S. opt out in the past couple of years.
So a couple of key issues, I think, that drove this. One is the president has been very clear, and the administration has been very clear, since coming back to office, that the Indo-Pacific is critically important to the United States. And I think you saw Secretary of State Marco Rubio really emphasize that point when he was here in July, saying that the U.S. recognizes that when the history of the 21st century is written, the most important chapters will be the parts that have to do with the Indo-Pacific. And the U.S. is an Indo-Pacific power. And so I think that's part of the framing for this. But I think that the really critical thing is the president recognizes the importance of engagement. And also, I think something that was sort of a bit unexpected was the border conflict between Cambodia and Thailand. And the president moved extremely quickly to engage, to make very clear that he wanted a ceasefire, to push both governments in the direction of peace. And in doing that, Malaysia was an indispensable partner. So I think that what you saw was the pieces come together. On one hand, a partnership to try and support peace between Cambodia and Thailand, where the U.S. and Malaysia worked extraordinarily closely with a level of coordination that I have seen extremely rarely in the time that I've been in Malaysia, which, it's basically 5 years split in two segments, but going back to 2014. And at the same time, a recognition on the part of the Malaysian government and the U.S. government of the importance of the trade and economic relationship between our countries, which led to a serious effort to try and close an agreement on reciprocal trade. And it's worth noting, Malaysia and Cambodia are the first two such agreements the United States has signed in the world. And so what we've seen is a recognition that the economic relationship is critical, but that the U.S. role in the region brings more than just prosperity. It brings security, it brings stability, and you've seen a president who is firmly committed to trying to end conflicts where he can.
Can I just go back to the Thailand-Cambodia ceasefire deal, which the U.S. played a monumental role? Beyond stopping the fighting, what does this episode tell us about the long-term influence from Washington in this region?
It's a great question, Cynthia, and I think that the key things are this. One, the U.S. continues to be a critical part of this region. I think that when you go back to the end of World War II, 80 years now, the U.S. has been vital for both promoting stability and security, and that has enabled countries in the region to develop, as well as promoting an economic architecture which has allowed countries to prosper. And obviously, countries continue to seek development, and there's more to do. But I think that everyone in the region fully understands that the U.S. provided the structures which were extraordinarily good for countries in the region, not just in Southeast Asia, but if you look, the U.S. and the U.S. market, the U.S. security umbrella, and the regional and global economic architecture has been critical to the development of Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and then, of course, China. And so, as well as throughout Southeast Asia. But I think what the peace discussions showed is that when the U.S. engages, and engages effectively, the U.S. makes a huge difference. And there's a tremendous reservoir of trust in the United States. Okay. That's not to say countries like necessarily, there was some concern in both Thailand and Cambodia about being pushed into this. Right. But I think that they also recognized this was the way to get an agreement that was good for everyone, for both countries, but for the entire region.
Right. Noted on that point, but if I can press a bit more on the ceasefire deal. So President Trump has said that the trade incentives for both countries were contingent on the durability of the ceasefire. So the question is, how does Washington plan to support the truce moving forward? And do you see that economic leverage is a sustainable tool to keep border conflicts or whatever conflicts at bay, or is that just more a short-term measure?
I think that you see several things. One is the president's made very clear that this matters to him. Okay. And I think that what you see is that this gives both countries an ability to say, we have to look at what is happening in a broader context and do what is good for the country as a whole. So I think the economic tools are part of the broader package, which is, on one hand, you've negotiated what I believe, and I admit to being very biased because I was very involved in negotiations, is a very fair agreement. Okay. Something that tries to address the concerns of both countries and make sure that neither country feels that the other has won and it is lost. At the same time, both of these discussions are seen by both countries as being in the context of their desire for strong economic ties with the United States and a recognition that jeopardizing those ties is not in their national interest.
All right. Now, speaking of economic ties, on trade, Malaysia and the U.S. has formalized a trade agreement, 19%, locking in 19% tariff, which was agreed back in August. What does this really mean for both sides? Give us a sense of the trade.
I think that the key thing on this is, number one, and I think this is incredibly important, Malaysia is one of the first two countries to get this kind of an agreement. Okay. An agreement which provides stability, continuity, and predictability. And that is incredibly important for investors. So separate from the nuts and bolts of the agreement, and I think that if you look at the agreement closely, there's benefits for both sides. But what it does is it gives certainty, and investors crave certainty. And I think that what you'll see in the coming months is a resurgence of investment into Malaysia, when I think it's fair to say that investment in the region had been paused in many cases as investors, private sector, was waiting to see greater signs of predictability in what would happen.
Are you referencing American investors?
I think not just American investors. I think investment from all parts of the world. So I think that you get that. But I think the agreement itself generates real benefits for people in both countries. Obviously, there is a concern in Malaysia about how did Malaysia do in this, and that's totally fair. Mm-hmm. I think from our perspective, we believe Malaysia negotiated with great skill and negotiated something which brought real benefits to Malaysia. Obviously, we also believe that this brings tremendous benefits to the United States and moves us in the direction of truly reciprocal trade rather than having a structural trade deficit with Malaysia. But I think that the broader thing is who benefits, who doesn't. I think one of the key things in this is Malaysia worked very hard to try and get benefits for the rural sector. And I think that if you look at what the agreement does in terms of palm oil, if you look at what it does in terms of rubber and other agricultural commodities, it's very clear. The government made a decision to try and support the livelihoods and the well-being of people who live and work in rural areas. It also made a decision that this brings benefits to the tech sector and to the E&E sector, both of which have been so important to powering Malaysia's growth. So I think that, obviously there are critics of this, but I think the government, the critics, and the critics have their own agendas, they have their own views. In some cases, they actually are based on economic issues. But I think that the key thing is the government made decisions, and the government chose to prioritize rural Malaysians and their well-being, and also chose to prioritize areas where Malaysia has traditionally been strong.
All right. Would you be able then to comment one part of the text? I'm going to a bit of a detail.
Are you
here.
going to read part of the text?
Just part. I'm going to summarize it. So one part of the text is that the U.S. can terminate the deal if it no longer aligns with American interests, and this includes situations involving bilateral agreements. How should Malaysia interpret this, right? And is this just a standard language, or is this a way to give flexibility built in for both sides, not just the American?
It's a good question, Cynthia, but what I would, the way I would look at this is every agreement includes some kind of mechanism for how you end the agreement. Governments change their minds, and so this is very, very standard. I think that's not the right thing to look at. And look, this cuts both ways. I mean, Malaysia is able to do the same. So Malaysia is not locked into this. If Malaysia feels its national interests change and it no longer has an interest in the prosperity and well-being of the Malaysian people, then it can choose to withdraw, and the U.S. can do the same. So that's normal. I think that the key thing is, what does this bring to the people of Malaysia? Who benefits? And I think that what you see is that this brings real benefits to Malaysians. I know that I've seen criticism or concern Malaysia surrendering its sovereignty. Obviously, I disagree. I think Malaysia is exercising its sovereignty to do something which is in the best interest of the Malaysian people and is in the best interest of the Malaysian economy.
All right. Well, thank you for that clarification, Ambassador. I really appreciate it. Okay. So this has been a week of trade deals, ceasefire, summits, agreements signed. I think the next question is, now that President Trump has left, what, in your opinion, is genuine long-term trust between the U.S. and Malaysia? How does that look like? And to a certain extent, to the broader region, what role do you see the U.S. will play moving forward?
I think the U.S. will continue to play the role that it has played for the past 80 years. The U.S. is part of the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. has tremendous interest in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. has been a major player in Southeast Asia, going back to the end of World War II, and I think that is clearly going to continue. We are massive investors here. There's a huge amount of trade. We're trying to rebalance the economic relationship, which our government believes has not been as favorable to the American people as it should have been. That is something that, I know there are people who disagree with that, but I don't think that anyone can question that this reflects the views of many people in the United States. So we're working on that, but doing it in a way that continues to build on the strengths of the relationship and partnership between Southeast Asia and the United States. I think when you look at this going forward, what you can see, and what I'm happy about, one, you could see the chemistry between the leaders. You could see the genuine joy on President Trump's face as he arrived. And, I have seen this. I've done many presidential visits over the course of my career. The arrival ceremony, the energy, this was one of the best, if not the best, I've ever seen. I've seen people talking about criticizing the president's dancing. I can tell you, when we've looked at social media, it is very clear. The overwhelming majority of Malaysians were delighted to see that. Yes, there's some critics. Yes, there are people who are not happy. That's completely normal. We fully understand their strong views. But I think that seeing the energy, seeing the president's excitement when he got to Kuala Lumpur, how impressed he was by Kuala Lumpur. One of the things that he mentioned to the Prime Minister right before his departure, the Prime Minister was talking about how these images had gone viral around the world. And the President said, yes, this is hundreds of millions of dollars of publicity for Malaysia. This, around the world, people are seeing incredibly positive images of Malaysia. You may see, I was just shown a clip that I'm told has gone viral around the world, including the US, of the drive on the MEX highway into Kuala Lumpur and how impressed people were. So, you know, this is something that brings extraordinary benefits to Malaysia. But I think that what it also does is it's a reminder of how well we work together. And that's why I think the negotiations on the trade agreement, the negotiations we had, which at times were quite difficult on the various other things we signed, the elevation to a comprehensive strategic partnership, the critical minerals memorandum of understanding, the maritime cooperation memorandum of understanding. What we saw was we're able to do so much when we work together. And on the Cambodia-Thailand thing, like I said, I've never seen Americans and Malaysians work so closely and effectively together. So I think the real benefit, separate from all this, the real benefit is the relationship between the leaders, a relationship between the governments, and a recognition of how well we can do when we do things together. And also, I think, an outpouring of goodwill towards the United States from the Malaysian public, which, look, there have been disagreements, and we recognize that. But I think it shows that the overwhelming majority of Malaysians want a positive relationship with the United States. They want a good relationship. And yes, there were people, we saw there were 100, maybe 150 demonstrators. We are glad that there were demonstrators because that shows Malaysia respects freedom of speech, that Malaysia is willing to support dissenting views. I find it interesting. Some of the people who are the most focused on those dissenting views had very different attitudes towards dissenting views when they were in government. So I think what we've seen is, yes, there's some people who are unhappy, but I think the overwhelming majority of Malaysians are really happy to see Malaysia get the attention it deserves and Malaysia really be highlighted as a strong partner to the United States.
There was also that moment where President Trump invited Prime Minister Anwar into the official limousine, the Beast. So I think many of us are curious, was that spontaneous? And in respect to diplomacy, from your point of view, how do you see that? What message does it send?
I think that, first of all, it was definitely spontaneous. The president doesn't do things like that based on what people like me tell him to do. The president wanted to do that. I can tell you there was a gasp. You couldn't really hear it because there was all the music. There was a gasp from all the security people on both sides about that. And, you know, look, there's a reality which is, and the Prime Minister Anwar sort of teased Secretary of State Rubio about this. In general, the systems on both sides don't really like the leaders to be together without anybody else because then we don't really know what they talked about. But what is clear to me, and I happened to see, I had the good fortune to see Malaysia's two deputy prime ministers last night, and I was telling them, this is what diplomats work for. And the reality is, I said to them, if it goes badly, it's the ambassador's fault. But when it's a success, it's because the leaders are great. And what we saw was we got the leaders together, they connected, they were able to have very candid conversations, including on tough issues like Gaza, where the Prime Minister was able to very articulately put forward Malaysia's views on Gaza. And I think he heard from the President of the President's strong commitment to maintaining the agreement in Gaza, trying to promote peace there and how important that is to him. So what you can see is there's one model, which is there's a room and all the people who matter are in the room. And there are people who are jumping up and down outside the window waving signs. And then, so that's one model. You know, sometimes you can hear their voices inside the room, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you notice the signs, sometimes you don't. The other model is you can be at the table in the room making your voice heard. I think the Prime Minister and the government of Malaysia have decided that that actually is a more effective model. And from the US perspective, we agree. We'd much rather have a serious conversation, and one where we're not necessarily going to agree, but where we understand each other's positions rather than have a bunch of sort of jumping up and down outside the room.
Okay. Now, in a couple of minutes that we do have left, I do want to get your point of view as ambassador to Malaysia. Where are some of the opportunities that you're most excited about now that ASEAN Summit is coming to an end and President Trump has left? What keeps you excited?
So what keeps me excited is that we have certainty and stability on the economic side. And one thing that I'm incredibly proud of as the U.S. ambassador here is that the U.S. has played such an extraordinary role in Malaysia's economic development. I think that if you go back, American companies have been present and doing business in Malaysia since the 1880s or 1890s. You can see, our friends from ExxonMobil talk about Standard Oil starting to do business in what's now Malaysia in that period. Our friends from Coca-Cola have been here for almost 100 years. There have been American investors who helped develop the tin industry, the rubber industry, and they obviously provided some of the demand. The oil and gas sector, Petronas, has an incredibly close partnership with American companies. You can see the impact that American tech firms had in Malaysia, in the investments there. And nothing makes me prouder than the fact that so many Malaysians have been trained by them and gone on to do so well. And it's no small thing. The CEOs of Broadcom, the highest paid CEO in the world, and of Intel, both are Malaysians. They're Malaysians who started working for American companies, where their talent was recognized, they were given opportunities like so many others. And when I go to meetings of the Malaysian Semiconductor Industry Association, to companies that are involved in the tech sector and the E&E sector, and I ask, how many of you here worked for an American company? Almost everybody raises their hand. At some point they work there. And look, this is not to take anything away for investors from other countries, but I don't think you can say that. So we've done so much, but there is so much more we can do. As Malaysia moves into an increasingly digitally based economy, as we look on how do we move Malaysia further up the value chain in the tech sector, I think that you can see that the U.S. market and U.S. partnership is critical. And I make this point to people that, Malaysia talks about the importance of being neutral. And I fully understand that's Malaysia's views. But it's also worth keeping in mind, I am not aware of any company which has moved production from China to Malaysia because they want to export to China. People are coming to Malaysia because they want to take advantage of Malaysia's integration into Western supply chains. And that is what has been powering Malaysia's economy. That's not to take anything away from trade with China. Malaysia imports a growing amount of things from China, a lot of consumer goods, and that is forcing Malaysian companies to compete in ways that they haven't had to do. And, that's completely legitimate. Malaysia also exports things to China. But Malaysia's most important export market continues to be the United States. And particularly when you look at the value added of goods, what does it bring to Malaysians? I think the U.S. continues to be Malaysia's most important economic partner. And I would just call your attention to the statistic that American companies in Malaysia pay twice the average Malaysian wage. And so Malaysians, and there are 300,000 plus Malaysians work directly for American companies. Our guess is that number is actually significantly higher because not every American company responded to it as we were doing the surveys. But also, American companies employ hundreds of thousands of people through contractors and subcontractors. And these are higher value added jobs. So we think that there's a synergy. Small things. American companies pay taxes. American companies are a significant share of Malaysia's research and development spending is done by American companies. That's not to say that investment from other places doesn't bring value, but I think that historically and going forward, you're going to see value come from American companies, from American investment, and investment that is driven by desire to be part of Western and American supply chains.
All right. So that's Malaysia. I would like to bring this to a broader view, ASEAN, of course. Looking ahead, in your opinion, what would a successful U.S.-ASEAN engagement look like that would put us on a more solid, sustainable path? Because I know you mentioned that this America is back again in this region. I think over the past decade, we have seen a bit of what appears to be a bit of hands-off approach. So continuity, trust.
Cynthia, look, I have to say I disagree with what you just said. I think that one of the things that is quite remarkable is you can go back 20 plus years and you see that the Indo-Pacific is an increasingly central focus of U.S. foreign policy. And I say this, George W. Bush administration paid a great deal of attention to the Indo-Pacific. Both China, India, Southeast Asia, strengthening relations with Japan, also Korea. The Obama administration did that. The Trump administration did that. The Biden administration did that. And the Trump administration is doubling down now. So I don't think that this is new. And I understand the basic premise of the point, but I think that what you can really see is a growing recognition in the United States that the Indo-Pacific is critical to U.S. security and prosperity, and that what happens here matters, and that we have to be part of the story. So I think that what I would argue is that how does successful U.S. engagement with ASEAN look? It looks like what we just saw. We are able to simultaneously strengthen bilateral ties with important partners. And I think that what you've seen is that two countries that many people felt were moving towards China, rightly or wrongly, and the Prime Minister always tells me I was wrong whenever I say that Malaysia's moving towards China, moving back. And I think it's significant. Cambodia and Malaysia signing these trade agreements, the participation in the peace agreement, the fact that they wanted the U.S. there, I think is very significant. At the same time, you saw improvement in our relationship with Thailand. And we signed a critical minerals MOU. We also announced a framework for the negotiation of an agreement on reciprocal trade. These are very significant. And at the same time, you've seen very significant and effective engagement with quite a few other Southeast Asian countries. So I think that it means a couple things. One is engaging with ASEAN, showing that we recognize that ASEAN matters to Southeast Asia, recognizing ASEAN centrality, but also using that as a platform to reinforce the strengthening of bilateral ties and the continued focus on things which we believe the U.S. can play a very important role on, including maritime security, including broader security issues in the region.
All right, and we look forward to continued U.S. engagement in this region and with Malaysia. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your time. Great to have you on the show.
Great. It's great to be here, Cynthia, and thank you, though you were a little tough, if I can just say.
Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Good to see you again.